Did you know medieval knights sometimes faced sudden, baffling disappearances from their intended brides? Were arranged marriages truly unbreakable, or did clever individuals find ways to vanish into the shadows? Uncover the subtle art of disappearing on a suitor in the bustling, intricate world of the 11th to the 15th centuries. Number 5. The Sacred Shield. Life in the medieval world, from the 11th century to the 15th century, was deeply interwoven with the rhythms and structures of the Church. For many, a profound connection to the divine shaped every aspect of existence, from daily prayers to the grand cycle of the liturgical year. For young noblewomen particularly, the Church offered more than just spiritual solace. It presented a path, a distinct alternative to the often predetermined course of marriage and domestic life within a feudal household. A suitor, perhaps a powerful lord from a neighboring county, or a younger son of a prominent baron, might arrive at a castle with an entourage, heralds proclaiming his lineage and his intentions. Air would be thick with anticipation, the castle halls buzzing with the possibilities of a new alliance, new lands, new prestige. Yet, for some women, the prospect of such a match, however advantageous it might appear to their family, carried a profound sense of foreboding or an utter lack of personal connection. Path to the sacred, to a life dedicated to God, was always open, at least in principle. For a woman of noble birth, entrance into a convent was a respected and honorable choice. It was not a decision taken lightly, nor was it easily reversed. A young lady might begin to display an unusual piety, a devotion to prayer that went beyond the expected norms. Her attendance at chapel might become more frequent, her hours spent in solitary contemplation lengthening. She might seek out the company of the castle's resident chaplain, or a visiting friar, engaging in lengthy discussions about theological matters, about the lives of saints, or the profound peace found in spiritual contemplation. Such a shift in focus, subtle at first, could begin to draw a curtain between her and the worldly pursuits of courtly life. Her family, perhaps initially proud of her newfound devotion, might begin to notice the growing intensity. She might express a deep yearning for a life of quiet study and unwavering prayer, a stark contrast to the boisterous feasts and political machinations that often characterized a noblewoman's existence. A suitor, arriving full of confidence and expectation, might find himself facing a lady whose gaze seemed to drift towards the stained glass windows of the chapel rather than his own expectant face. Her conversations might subtly shift from the latest court news or the merits of a new hunting hawk to the theological debates raging among scholars or the intricacies of monastic vows. The process of entering a convent was not instantaneous. It involved a period of discernment, a novitiate, during which the prospective nun lived within the convent walls, experiencing the daily routine of prayer work and community life. This period, often a year or more, provided a convenient and entirely legitimate reason for a woman to be removed from the public eye, inaccessible to suitors. Letters from the suitor would likely be received by the convent's abbess, a woman of formidable authority and spiritual gravitas, who would politely but firmly explain the novice's unavailability, citing her deep commitment to her spiritual journey and the strictures of monastic life. Records from various convents indicate that young women, sometimes of high birth, entered these holy houses, often to the quiet relief of their families, who saw it as a pious act, perhaps even an opportunity to secure prayers for their lineage. Beyond the convent walls, other forms of sacred commitment also offered a way to fade from the marriage market. Pilgrimage, a journey to a holy site, was a powerful act of faith undertaken for penance, for thanksgiving, or to seek divine intervention. While perilous and arduous, particularly for women, extended pilgrimages were not unheard of. A lady might suddenly declare a profound need to visit the shrine of St. James at Compostela, or perhaps even embark on the exceptionally long and dangerous journey to Jerusalem. Such a spiritual quest, undertaken with the blessing of the church, and often with a sizable retinue for protection, would effectively remove her from the local social landscape for months or even years. The distances involved, the slow pace of travel, the inherent dangers of the road, and the sheer difficulty of communication across vast medieval landscapes meant that a suitor, no matter how persistent, would find it almost impossible to maintain contact. Messages could take weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all, and a response would be equally delayed. The very notion of tracking down a pilgrim across a continent with no fixed itinerary beyond the next holy site was daunting to the point of impossibility. Chroniclers often described the profound impact of such journeys on those who undertook them, and the social acceptance of such an endeavor was unwavering. Moreover, a profound and sudden spiritual awakening, even without immediately entering a convent or embarking on a pilgrimage, could be used to create distance. A woman might declare herself dedicated to a life of asceticism within her own home, spending her days in prayer and fasting, withdrawing from the social events and courtly entertainments that brought her into contact with potential suitors. She might wear simpler garments, decline invitations to dances or feasts, and generally cultivate an aura of devout separation from worldly concerns. Her meals might become sparse, her sleep broken by vigils. While not a formal religious vow, such a radical shift in lifestyle, understood and respected within the Christian framework of the age, could effectively deter a suitor seeking a wife who would be a vibrant social companion and a full participant in the secular life of a noble household. The expectations for a medieval noblewoman included managing a large household, overseeing servants, entertaining guests, and engaging in the social rituals that cemented alliances. A woman who appeared to reject these responsibilities in favor of constant prayer and self-denial would, in many cases, simply cease to be an appealing prospect. The Church, in its vast authority and influence, inadvertently provided a sanctuary, a powerful shield against unwanted attention. By embracing a life of spiritual devotion, whether in a convent, on a distant pilgrimage, or through an ascetic existence within her own family's lands, a woman could make herself inaccessible, her reasons unassailable, and her very presence vanish from the suitor's immediate world, leaving him with little recourse but to seek his fortune elsewhere. The sanctity of her chosen path meant that very few would dare to question her motivations, let alone attempt to forcibly divert her from her spiritual quest. Her disappearance into the embrace of the divine was often total, leaving behind only the memory of her devotion and the quiet understanding that she had chosen a different kind of destiny. Number 4. The unseen journey. In the intricate tapestry of medieval life, travel was a fundamental, if arduous, reality. The notion of a fixed address, particularly for the nobility, was often more theoretical than practical. Lords and ladies frequently moved between their various estates, visiting family, overseeing lands, attending court, or engaging in various social and political obligations. This constant flux of movement, facilitated by slow, difficult journeys over poorly maintained roads, presented a remarkable opportunity for a discreet disappearance. A suitor, perhaps a younger son of a powerful family, or a knight seeking to improve his standing through an advantageous match, might arrive at a lady's primary residence only to discover she was not there. The news would be delivered by a polite but unyielding steward. "My lady is currently at her mother's family estate, a journey of several weeks, overseeing matters of inheritance." Or perhaps the lady has accompanied her father to the king's court, where weighty matters are being discussed. Her return date is quite uncertain. These were not idle excuses, but plausible realities of the medieval aristocratic existence. A suitor, having perhaps ridden for days to reach his intended, would be left with the choice of waiting indefinitely, perhaps for weeks or even months, or embarking on an equally arduous journey to follow her. The difficulty of communication meant that news of her return or her new whereabouts would travel slowly, if at all. Letters hand-delivered by messengers were vulnerable to theft, misdirection, or simply being lost in the vast, often dangerous landscape. A message detailing her precise location might arrive a month after she had already moved on. Consider the complexity of royal progresses. When a king or queen traveled through their realm, they were accompanied by a vast retinue, including many noble families. These journeys could last for months, moving from one castle to another, consuming resources and engaging in local governance. A young lady, perhaps attending the queen as a lady-in-waiting, would be part of this moving court. Her location would shift constantly, her schedule dictated by the monarch's whims. A suitor, attempting to track her down, would be faced with a logistical nightmare. He would need to ascertain the court's current location, dispatch messengers, and then, if he received a reply, undertake the journey himself, only to perhaps find that the court had moved again in the interim. The sheer impracticality of sustained pursuit across such distances often led to the gradual fading of a suitor's interest. Their resources, time, and patience were finite. Beyond official duties, personal visits to distant relatives were also a common occurrence. A lady might decide, or her family might subtly encourage, an extended visit to an aunt living in a remote corner of the kingdom, or to a cousin who had married into a family several shires away. These were not short trips. The journey itself could consume weeks, and the stay could last for months, particularly during periods when travel was difficult, such as during winter. The lack of reliable maps, the prevalence of banditry, and the slow pace of horse travel meant that even relatively short distances could take days. News of her departure might reach the suitor's ears weeks after she had already gone. By the time he decided to attempt a visit, she might have moved on to yet another relative, or simply have begun her slow journey home. The lack of reliable and rapid communication was key. No instantaneous updates, no tracking devices, just the vague, delayed whispers of the road. Even within a single lord's domain, strategic absence could be employed. A lady might have a small, isolated hunting lodge, or a secluded chapel on a distant part of the estate where she could retreat for a period of quiet reflection, or ostensibly to oversee some minor agricultural matter. While not as grand as a cross-kingdom journey, such a retreat could still render her unavailable for days, or even weeks. Her servants would be instructed to politely inform any callers that she was not available, occupied with private matters that could not be disturbed. The suitor might find himself waiting in the great hall, day after day without an audience, the polite but firm refusal wearing down his resolve. Furthermore, a noblewoman might embark on an extended tour of her family's various holdings, ostensibly to inspect her future dowry lands, or to understand the management of her family's numerous properties. This grand tour, perhaps even involving a visit to land she would inherit or bring into a marriage, would be an entirely legitimate activity. Yet, by extending it indefinitely, or by changing her itinerary subtly and without notice, she could remain perpetually out of reach. Her route might become deliberately circuitous. Her arrival dates at specific castles mysteriously delayed. The logistics of supplying such a traveling party were complex, and minor delays or changes in plans were entirely plausible. A suitor would receive news of her presence in one village only to arrive and discover she had departed 2 days prior for a neighboring county, with no fixed date for her next stop. The constant movement, the difficulty of communication, and the inherent dangers of travel combined to create a medieval landscape ripe for strategic disappearing. A woman, with a subtle encouragement or active planning of her family, could simply become a moving target, perpetually one step ahead of an unwanted suitor. Her presence, once a certainty in her family's main castle, would transform into a series of vague reports from distant lands, each one further diminishing the suitor's hope of a successful courtship. He would be left with the frustrating reality of pursuing a phantom, a lady always just beyond his grasp, until eventually the effort became too great, and the pursuit was abandoned altogether. Her absence was not a rejection, but a physical barrier, an insurmountable distance created by the very nature of medieval travel and communication. Number 3. The persistent ailment. In the medieval world, the human body was a mystery, prone to sudden fevers, lingering coughs, and unexplained weaknesses. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, based largely on ancient texts and empirical observations. Illness was often seen as a divine punishment, a test of faith, or a natural occurrence beyond human control. This pervasive uncertainty surrounding health offered a remarkably effective and socially acceptable means of avoiding an unwanted suitor: the sudden, persistent, and entirely unverifiable ailment. A suitor, having perhaps journeyed for days or weeks to present his suit, might arrive at the lady's castle filled with hope and expectation. He would be greeted by servants, perhaps the lady's own chamberlain or a trusted lady in waiting, who would convey the somber news: "My lady has been taken ill, a sudden chill, a persistent cough, a weakness in her limbs." The details would be vague, the prognosis uncertain. She might be confined to her bedchamber, shielded from visitors by concerned family members, and a retinue of attendants. The very notion of insisting on a visit, or questioning the veracity of her illness, would be considered unspeakably rude, even dangerous, given the fear of contagion and the respect accorded to the sick. The nature of the illness could be anything from a fever that caused her to feel too weak to leave her bed, to a melancholy that rendered her unable to face company. Chronic coughs, a common complaint in drafty medieval castles, could be exaggerated into a debilitating ailment preventing her from speaking or breathing easily. A sudden onset of headache or migraine could confine her to a darkened room, making her utterly unavailable for pleasant conversation or formal introductions. These ailments, common enough to be entirely believable, were also conveniently difficult to disprove. There were no blood tests or advanced diagnostics. Paleness of complexion, a feigned cough at opportune moments, or a general air of fragility could sustain the illusion for weeks, even months. The suitor would be left in a perplexing position, could not demand an audience, nor could he simply depart without appearing callous or disrespectful. He might send gifts of medicines or special foods, hoping to aid her recovery, but these would be received by her attendants, perhaps with grateful thanks, but no immediate improvement in her condition. Days would turn into weeks. News of her condition might fluctuate. "My lady is slightly improved today, but still very weak," followed by, "Alas, she had a relapse last night and is much worse." This constant oscillation between slight hope and renewed despair would wear down the most persistent suitor. The social customs surrounding illness further reinforced its effectiveness as a ghosting tactic. It was considered proper for a sick person to be kept in quiet solitude, especially a noblewoman whose delicate constitution was believed to be easily disturbed. The idea of her coming to the great hall or engaging in courtly dances while suffering from a vague but persistent illness was out of the question. Her family, perhaps complicit in the charade or simply resigned to her genuine or feigned fragility, would enforce the isolation, politely turning away messengers and visitors with updates on her slow, arduous path to recovery, a path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the future. Historians have documented instances where individuals, often women, sought refuge in illness from unwanted social obligations. The stresses of medieval life, including the prospect of an unwelcome marriage, could genuinely manifest as physical ailments, providing a convenient cover. A woman might genuinely feel unwell due to anxiety, and this genuine discomfort could then be amplified and used to create an impenetrable barrier. The boundaries between genuine illness and strategic withdrawal blurred in a world where diagnosis was a matter of guesswork and observation. The length of the confinement could be extended indefinitely, just as the suitor might begin to lose hope and consider departing. A slight improvement might be announced, enough to rekindle a flicker of interest, only for the illness to return shortly thereafter, keeping him in a perpetual state of frustrated anticipation. He would eventually realize that the lady's recovery was either impossibly slow or that her condition was such that she would never be a suitable wife in the foreseeable future. Constant deferral, the elusive promise of an audience that never materialized, would gradually exhaust his patience and his resources. Moreover, the sheer practicalities of remaining at a castle for an extended period, waiting for a lady to recover from an unspecified malady, were challenging. He would be an ongoing guest, consuming his host's resources, perhaps even a burden. His own duties and responsibilities at his home manor would call him back. Cost of maintaining his retinue, the drain on his personal time, and the general social awkwardness of his lingering presence would all contribute to his eventual departure. He would leave not with a formal rejection which could lead to feuds or insult, but with the understanding that the lady, through no fault of her own, was simply unavailable. Her disappearance into a world of shadowed bedchambers and hushed whispers left him with no clear path forward, only the lingering scent of lavender and the polite regrets of her household. Number 2. The Tangled Weave of Kin. Medieval society was a complex web of alliances, obligations, and inherited rights, all centered around the family. Marriage was rarely a matter of individual romantic choice. It was a fundamental tool for securing land, forging political alliances, settling disputes, and continuing powerful lineages. When a suitor presented himself, often through formal intermediaries, the courtship was less about personal chemistry and more about the intricate negotiations between two families. This inherent complexity, with its myriad financial, political, and social considerations, provided fertile ground for a nuanced form of ghosting, the deliberate, prolonged, and ultimately insurmountable creation of bureaucratic and familial obstacles. A suitor, perhaps a powerful lord, or a wealthy merchant seeking to ascend the social ladder, would initiate negotiations through his own family or appointed representatives. The lady's family, acting on her behalf or at her subtle prompting, could then begin to raise a series of increasingly elaborate and difficult issues. The dowry, the property or wealth a bride brought to her husband, was a primary point of contention. While the suitor might have proposed a certain amount, the lady's family could insist on a higher sum or more favorable terms regarding its transfer or return in case of her death or the marriage's dissolution. Proposed dowry does not fully reflect our daughter's standing. They might state, or we require more clarity on the precise nature of the lands to be settled upon her as dower. These seemingly reasonable demands could stretch negotiations for months or even years. Legal experts, scribes, and family elders would be called in, poring over ancient charters and land records, finding ever more minute details to dispute. Beyond the dowry, the question of inheritance and succession was paramount. If the lady was an heiress, her family might insist on complex clauses ensuring her male heirs would inherit, or that her property would remain distinct from her husband's. If the suitor had numerous siblings, the lady's family might express concerns about the potential for disputes over inheritance or the provision for her own children. We must ensure the future of any children born of this union, they would declare, and the exact legal standing of your secondary estates requires careful examination. These were not empty words. Such matters could determine the future wealth and power of generations. By raising these complex legal and feudal questions, the lady's family could create a labyrinth of negotiations that even the most determined suitor would find exhausting. Political alignments could also become a sudden, insurmountable barrier. A suitor might arrive from a region or a family that, unbeknownst to him, had recently fallen out of favor with the lady's powerful overlord, or whose alliances shifted. Our family has recently reaffirmed its fealty to Lord de Montfort, the lady's father might explain, and your connections to the House of Beaumont, while historically strong, now present a regrettable complication. Or perhaps, we understand your family has pledged support to the Duke of Brittany, but our own interests now align more closely with the Count of Anjou. These shifts were commonplace in the ever-changing political landscape of the medieval era. Such an excuse, based on high politics, was impossible to argue against, as it concerned matters of loyalty, oaths, and potential warfare, far beyond the suitor's personal influence. Even the suitor's own lineage could be subject to sudden meticulous scrutiny. While his family might be well known, a meticulous search through old records or whispers among distant kin could unearth a minor, almost forgotten stain on his ancestry. A distant cousin who had committed treason, a great aunt rumored to have practiced pagan rites, or a disputed claim to a remote parcel of land generations ago. Our genealogists have uncovered a minor yet concerning omission in your family's records regarding the grant of the lands of Pharaoh in the year 1278, they might state, with grave faces. Such defects, however minor, could be presented as significant enough to cast doubt on the wisdom of the match, requiring further investigation that would take months or even years. These investigations would yield no conclusive answers, only more questions, more delays, and more paperwork. The sheer bureaucracy of the medieval world, though seemingly less formalized than today, was, in fact, incredibly intricate. Charters needed to be drawn up, seals affixed, witnesses summoned, and agreements ratified by powerful lords. Each step could be deliberately slowed, each document requiring multiple revisions, each meeting postponed due to unforeseen circumstances or the need for further consultation. The family, subtly guided by the lady's disinterest, would ensure that every proposed solution created 3 new problems. Every concession was met with a new, equally complex demand. The suitor would find himself perpetually caught in a cycle of protracted discussions, waiting for messengers to return with new information only to be met with another hurdle. This tactic rarely involved outright rejection, which could invite retaliation or a feud. Instead, it was a gentle, polite, but utterly frustrating erosion of the suitor's patience and resources. He would not be told no, but rather that the terms were not quite right. The timing was unfortunate, or the legal intricacies were too challenging at this moment. Constant delays, the insurmountable obstacles, and the sheer effort required to navigate the tangled weave of familial and feudal negotiations would eventually lead the suitor to a quiet, weary retreat. He would simply cease his efforts, his initial enthusiasm drained by the endless bureaucratic battles, leaving the lady unapproachable, not by her own direct refusal, but by the impenetrable wall of her family's prudence and due diligence. Her disappearance was not a flight, but a slow, calculated retreat behind a fortress of paperwork and carefully worded objections. Number 1. The Eccentric Bloom. In a society where conformity was often valued and individual expression carefully channeled, deviations from the norm, even subtle ones, could render a person less appealing on the marriage market. For a woman seeking to avoid a suitor without incurring scandal or direct familial disapproval, cultivating an eccentric reputation was a surprisingly effective, if understated, tactic. It was not about outright defiance or dishonor, but about becoming not quite right, in a way that made her a less desirable partner for a pragmatic, reputation-conscious medieval lord. A noblewoman was expected to embody certain virtues: grace, domestic skill, piety, within reason, social charm, and a general air of decorum. If a lady subtly began to cultivate habits or interests that deviated from these expectations, she could create a quiet barrier. Perhaps she developed an intense, almost obsessive interest in a scholarly pursuit, typically reserved for monks or male academics. She might spend hours poring over illuminated manuscripts, learning Latin or Greek, or discussing obscure theological points with the castle chaplain. While learning was respected, An excessive devotion to it could make her seem ill-suited for the practical management of a large household or the social duties of a noblewoman. Her conversations might drift towards dusty texts rather than the latest gossip, or her appearance might be neglected in favor of study. A suitor seeking a charming, sociable companion to grace his court would find himself faced with a woman whose mind seemed perpetually elsewhere, lost in the intricacies of ancient philosophy or the properties of rare herbs. Conversely, she might develop a peculiar, unladylike hobby. Instead of embroidery or lute playing, she might become fascinated by falconry to an unusual degree, not just participating but actively training the birds herself. Spending hours in the mews, her hands perhaps bearing the nicks and scars of a practiced handler. Or she might develop an odd affinity for animals, collecting an unusual assortment of pets. Not just dogs or cats, but perhaps a tamed raven, a ferret, or even a small monkey. Animals that would be considered strange companions for a lady. Her chambers might be filled with the sounds and smells of these creatures, a constant subtle reminder of her unusual tastes. While not scandalous, such eccentricities could make her seem unsuitable to a suitor who envisioned a conventional, demure wife. Her demeanor could also be subtly shifted. She might become overly pious, even for the medieval age. While piety was a virtue, an extreme, almost monastic devotion could make her seem detached from worldly concerns. She might spend an inordinate amount of time in chapel, fast excessively, or engage in practices that made her seem unsuited for the joyous, often boisterous life of a medieval court. Her conversation might constantly steer towards spiritual matters, making light banter or courtly flirtation impossible. A suitor seeking a lively mistress for his hall might find her perpetually solemn, her eyes cast downwards, her replies brief and focused on the salvation of souls. Another approach involved the cultivation of a perceived flaw in temperament or domestic competence. While she might be perfectly capable, she could subtly project an image of being utterly hopeless with household management, perhaps accidentally mismanaging accounts or overseeing a kitchen disaster that was just dramatic enough to be noticed. Or she might develop a reputation for being unusually clumsy, breaking delicate objects, or spilling wine at inopportune moments. These were not grave faults, but cumulative annoyances that could make a suitor question her suitability as a chatelaine, the mistress of a castle responsible for its smooth running and reputation. Furthermore, she might cultivate a peculiar sense of humor, perhaps too sharp, too dry, or too intellectual for the general tastes of the court. Her wit might fly over the heads of most, or worse, make others feel subtly mocked without ever crossing the line into outright insult. Or she might develop an interest in local folklore and superstitions that made her seem a little too connected to the old ways, perhaps whispering about forest spirits or charms in a way that made her seem a little too wild or mysterious for comfort. These were not direct accusations of witchcraft, but a subtle cultivation of an unconventional aura. The beauty of the eccentric bloom tactic lay in its subtlety and deniability. No one could accuse the lady of being dishonorable or disobedient. She was simply different, a bit peculiar, or not quite suited. Her family might sigh and express mild concern over her unusual habits, but they could not actively fault her, particularly if her quirks remained within socially acceptable bounds. The suitor, meanwhile, would find himself subtly deterred. He would not be rejected outright, but rather find himself increasingly disinclined to pursue a woman who seemed more interested in dusty tomes than him, or whose strange pets followed her everywhere, or whose piety made her seem aloof. He would simply drift away, finding the connection unformed, the courtship lacking in any genuine spark, attributing it to her personal peculiarities rather than a direct rejection. Her disappearance from his consideration was not a sudden vanishing act, but a slow, almost imperceptible fading, as her unique bloom simply failed to attract his particular kind of bee.